For example, it's actually always a big question. So do you have some universal pricing policy, or you have to work from like market to market? So unfortunately, I cannot launch a poll at this moment because we don't have enough participants in Zoom to judge on it. But let us explain. So why do we have this topic? So let me tell you a story that just happened yesterday, like literally yesterday. One of my clients is a company that works in the pharmaceutical industry and tries to penetrate the market in Poland. So when it came to the moment when we had to announce some pricing to the distributor, there was a big discussion. So what kind of pricing should we give to the Polish distributor? So it was like a lot of guessing and the assumptions and so on and so on. And eventually, so the company ended up to propose a price which was much higher than in the headquarters, so in the headquarter country. So eventually, after a couple of months of negotiations, so the local distributor started to compare the price in the home country and in his own country. So what was proposed. So and eventually he was very much confused. People started to join, so I have to interrupt myself. Sorry. So he was very much confused with this. So what happens in this kind of situation? Usually it means that the trust is damaged, the relationship is damaged. So this is just one of the examples. So Kathryn, you also can share your insights because I know that you have much more, much bigger experience than I have. And I'm sure that you can comment a lot about it.
I think there are also a lot of companies who just literally, they have, for example, an international price list, and they quote this international price list to basically every client. And unless that client is promising to take like huge quantities from them, which is really unlikely in the beginning of a relationship, then they're not offering any discounts on that. They're just giving them a price, take it or leave it. And they pretty much leave the importer alone to manage the rest of the value chain, which means that they either could be leaving money on the table, or they're just ignoring what is the shelf price or what is the general price level in the market that they're dealing with. So they might be ruining their chances of doing good business over the long term with that particular distributor, simply because they haven't considered all of the components that go into making up the pricing. So the distributor, if he can't make a profit, then of course he's not going to push your products. On the other hand, you also have to be able to make a profit. So it's got to be, let's say it's got to be a balance, and everybody has to be earning some money, because otherwise you're not going to do the business over the long term. And I think that is the most important part of it, that you've got to, everybody has to earn some money, but also it has to be a product that consumers can still buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we decided to organize this webinar, because we believe that the companies still have a lot of misunderstanding of, okay, so I have some price model for my local market, but at this moment I'm targeting a totally different market. For example, okay, my headquarters is in European Union, but I want to move to the interesting market like Thailand or India or even the United States. So how the product should be priced? Do we just convert our local price to a different currency? So should we just do this or not? So to answer this question, so we decided to show you this couple of models. So some of our participants probably know that I'm also teaching students, and this is the model which I'm trying to explain to the students that have the commercial specialty and who are going also to sell to some key accounts, to work as export managers in the future. So in this model, which I was trying to make it as clear as possible. So different like earnings, different addings are colored in different colors. So so that you can, okay, someone is, okay. So if you have a question, you also can raise your hand, and then we will unmute you, and you can comment or ask a question. Sorry. So coming back to the price structure. Price structure is always, you know, if we're talking about your local market, we always know what's going on. We know our cost of goods because we produce this product locally. We know how much we earn on it. We know what is the local distributor margin, or maybe you don't need even a distributor. Maybe you sell directly to retail. So you know how much this retailer is making. Also, that this kind of components as back margin of the distributors, all the additional discounts, all the additional retro bonuses. All these kind of unknowns if we speak about an international market. So what do I mean with this? That, you know, when the company starts exporting, it's also like stepping into the minefield. So they never know, okay, in the good, it's good thing is that they, for example, start exporting to a new market and know if there is VAT on this market or not. If there is, for example, a product which VAT is the full one, or just some reduction, because, for example, in the case of pharmaceuticals, the VAT is lower than the common one. So they, of course, don't know what is the normal retailer margin on this market. So also because the countries are different, you know, logistics is different. It can be a very big country, for example, United States, or it can be a very big market like China. You know, in the countries like the United States and China, distributors, they almost never work to the whole country. They work only with some part of the country, which means that they deliver it. You maybe need also not one distributor, but 4 or 5 for the same market. So maybe on top of it, like in the case of the United States, so if you start selling consumer products to the US, you need to consider also some earnings for the importer. We need also some maybe percentage to be given to brokers who put this product on the shelf of the retail. So there are a lot of unknowns. So the company always has to, you know, manipulate and like sort of solve the equation with many unknowns. And that's always a problem. So how to do this, and what are you gonna do so that you give your distributor some pricing that you can justify, and how to make sure that your product is still can be sold on the market. So what would you do? The question is,
yeah,
what would you do?
And I personally would start at the point in time where I'm doing research into the market, because for me, doing this kind of bottom-up price calculation would be part of me checking whether I really actually have product market fit for a particular country. So I would start by saying, okay, which parts of this equation do I already know? So I know that what the product costs me to produce, and I know which profit margins that I need to have. I can quite easily find out the technical parts of the equation, like how much approximately will the transport cost me? How much is the customs duty likely to be? I can add in a certain percentage for additional logistics costs, for import costs, and so on. And things like VAT in a country, this is something that I can easily investigate. So the two big unknowns usually are the distributor margin. At the beginning stage, I would calculate it as a total, that I would just say, okay, maybe this is a 30% margin or a 25% margin, and a retailer margin, which for the beginning I would also calculate on a total basis rather than splitting it into front and back margins. And I would literally calculate from the bottom upwards. So it costs me X to produce, and then I would add all of these percentages to arrive at a potential shelf price. And at that point, I have to do some on-the-ground market research, or I have to get somebody to do that research for me. Maybe I can do some of it online these days, because if we're talking about food and beverage, or we're talking about consumer goods, then lots of products are also sold online through regular channels. So you can find out that information and see if you have a realistic, let's say, if your idea about what the price has got to be as a minimum could be reasonable. And then when you've established that actually, yes, my product could be reasonable for this market, then you actually go into the situation of starting to talk to distributors. And when you start to do those real-time investigations, then you have to look at the price level, how you want to position your product on the market, and calculate backwards. And you have to all the time have, let's say, at the beginning of any market entry, you have to always work with some kind of generalizations or some kind of average values that later on you can put quantities on individual product groups. You can do weighted calculations. You can make the whole thing really a lot more complicated. But for the beginning, it's usually enough to say, okay, I've got, for example, 15% VAT. I've got on average a 35% retailer margin in total. I've got on average a 25% distributor margin, and calculate backwards to see what the price can be to your potential distribution partner. And you have to talk very openly with your partners about this and really see what margins they need. And like you've mentioned also on the slide, you have to really take care to make sure that everybody is talking the same language, because there's often this confusion between a markup, which is calculated from the bottom up, which is usually like a sales tax, for example. So you take the base level to be 100 and you add 20%, for example, onto that. Or are you talking about a margin, which is calculated top down? And so, for example, if you have a 20% margin, that usually works out as a 25% markup. And those are the kind of values that you need to be very clear about when you're discussing with your partners, because otherwise you don't only end up in a confused situation, but you end up in a situation that somebody is losing money. And there's no faster way to ruin a relationship than to be arguing about money from the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your very clear input. I could add only that, it sounds very easy but on practice, it's always a lot of work and hard work and a lot of understanding and insights, because of course you cannot Google the information. So, okay, I want to move with my business to Vietnam. So I want to know what is a retailer front margin or back margin in this country. So all you need to do is, of course, before you actually even start looking for a partner, you need to be prepared, because this local company will definitely be prepared. They know about the market and they know about their expectation. So before you send them a price list, you should be prepared as well. So you can do it only with one way. So you have to do some research. You need a person who will deliver you this information and make you prepared for before the negotiations even start.
Yeah. And of course, there are people who can help you with that. I mean, lots of countries have this overseas commercial service where they can often provide you with average values for those kind of pieces of information, but they are not specialists in your industry. And you still have to, I would recommend to anybody, don't just send a price. You should never just send a price list to somebody. You should always sit down with them before that and always discuss with them how they, what their ideas are about how margins should look, because maybe they will say to you that there's actually an additional layer of distribution in the whole calculation that you hadn't considered. So you need to really think about that, and you need to think about each step in detail. So on the one hand, you don't want to build in, let's say, a 1% puffer on every step of the calculation, because otherwise you end up at a really inflated price. But you do have to be realistic and say that costs such as transport can vary quite rapidly. If something happens on the world oil markets, or if, for example, often container ships to Asia, you pay a kind of risk premium for them to go past Somalia and for them to go through the Gulf because they see that as being quite risky. You have to also think that at some point in most international transactions, you're also doing a currency conversion, and currencies can move quite drastically. At least enough.
I have one more slide about that. So
at least enough that they can very quickly eat up your true profit margin. So you have to be quite open and realistic with your partners from the start about what margins people are expecting, and you have to be very clear from day one as to what is the backstop for you. I mean, in any sales negotiation, you should be clear about that. But often in export, for some reason, people don't have that clear picture for themselves of, this is the biggest possible margin I can offer to this distributor, or this is the lowest possible price that I can offer to somebody. And it just becomes a kind of, let's see who can get the most for themselves in the short term. But if you're looking at an export business, because it's very complex and the relationship tends to be built up more for the long term than perhaps in your domestic market, you're not just looking to do one sale, you're looking to have an ongoing business over the next 5, 10, maybe even 20 years or longer, then you need to be, let's say, talking about these critical topics right from the beginning in order to have that clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it literally, sometimes there is no even need, or the company should understand realistically that the price structure doesn't allow us to sell in this market, because there is a sort of pressure from the both sides. So market is pressing it. So the product, for example, becomes too expensive. And on the other hand, also the distribution cost is such that the distributor cannot afford it to work with a lower margin. It's not only because they really try to earn as much as possible on your side. This is realistically in very often. So, there are specific markets when the product has to be certified, when the custom clearance has to be paid, when the country is big and the logistic cost and some transportation cost is really high. One example is, for example, I see we have a participant in India, so I will answer your question just in a couple of minutes. For example, if the company is producer of alcohol drinks and wants to start exporting to India, then it's huge custom duty that has to be paid if the product isn't produced in the country, which means that it has to be that cheap, or it has to be produced locally. Otherwise, local population simply will not be able to afford it, or otherwise it has to be a known brand or some premium product with a famous producer or something like that. So realistically, there is no even point to propose to this kind of company, some, I don't know, alcohol producer from Bulgaria, for example, that wants to, we have some nice vodka we want to export to India, but they don't realize that the product becomes a few times more expensive only because when it crosses the border, then the custom duty to be paid is more than 100%.
Yeah.
So this is crazy. So it's definitely the pressures from the both sides. And sometimes, okay, we really want to sell to the market of the United States, but okay, so how much these distributors want? Also, how much support do you want to give to your distributors? Because in the US, of course, it's a super competitive market and everything is done only with good marketing support. Can you afford it? So can you put it in your price structure? So as a, for example, distributor back margin or retailer back margin. So because retailer also will need some support in store and so on. So there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of points to be clarified before you start working on your local price list. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think that there are certain kinds of products, alcohol being one of them, that in lots of markets, the local production is protected by, let's say, very punitive import taxes on imported products. I had a client a couple of years back who would have been interested to sell to Vietnam beer, but because of the really high levels of import tax that there would be on, especially on stronger beer, not just the very, like, say, not just Heineken kind of very weak beer, then it just wasn't worth it because there was too much pressure in the whole value chain that you couldn't make a price that would be viable for consumers to pay on those products.
Yeah. So sometimes also it's certification cost. So I know that, for example, if the product is certified to be sold in China, then in this case, it's a whole story and it becomes really expensive because every SKU has to be certified. I'm talking, for example, about cosmetic products. So each, okay.
But food is the same.
Yeah, 100 lipsticks, every SKU must need separate certificate and it costs a fortune eventually. So for the companies that are beginners in export, I would not recommend this kind of complicated markets. So it's better to export to the same, I don't know, currency zone and with like a market nearby, which is clear and can be understood easily. Okay,
I think if you have that option, then for sure this is clear. And I think that one other point that companies have to consider is really how they want to be positioned on the market, and that they should actively decide on that price positioning together with their distribution partner. So if, for example, if you're talking about Coca-Cola, then everybody knows that Coca-Cola is a huge international brand. They're often filled, maybe not in the country itself, but they might be filled somewhere in the region. So they're expensive, but they're not really expensive. If you go into a market, though, and you have, for example, Shiseido cosmetics, then you're always going to be extremely expensive compared to other products on the market, because that is the brand positioning. And I think that for smaller brands or for challenger brands, they have to think very hard about how they want to be positioned, because in very, very many markets worldwide, you will find that you might be a mass market price point in your domestic market, but once you go into a foreign market, you become a kind of luxury product, partly because of the additional charges and partly by virtue of the fact that you're imported into the country. So you probably are not going to be able to compete with the locally produced mass market products. You're probably competing with other imported products, and you have to really think about how you want to sit in that kind of constellation, because it's very unlikely that you're going to sit in exactly the same place as you do in your home market. So if you come from a market which is known for producing really cheap products, you might be able to compete locally in the price entry segment, but also possibly not if you're faced with high customs charges, or you come from a country where you have to calculate a big margin of error, let's say, for currency movements. So I think that is something that companies shouldn't underestimate, the importance of deciding how they want to position their product from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, we had a question also about this. Let me. Sorry. What is that? We had a question. Can you explain how fluctuations in exchange rates can impact pricing strategies and how to mitigate risks? Sorry. Yeah, it's a big question. So I, in the past, worked in the country which had a local currency. So we had to import the product. For example, when I worked in Sony Corporation, so it was a different life, and I worked in big international companies, and we had to import product and pay for that in euro, because Sony had some warehouse in Europe, and the local currency was very unstable, and specifically it was hit very much during the crisis of 2008, 2009. And I remember that this problem was because product was not produced locally, it was electronic, so we had to import it. So we had to constantly reconsider our sales plans and budget and price models as well. So because it was, you are buying in euro, you put it on the shelf in the local currency. So it's always risky. So, you know, even inside such a economic zone as European Union, some companies still keep their own currency. One of good examples is Poland. Poland is, you know, not considered by many companies as an important market, and this is actually a mistake, because this economy is booming, so it's growing really, really fast, and this is an important market. However, Poland still keep their own currency, you know, they still operate in Polish zloty. What does it mean? That yes, you have to import products, for example, from European Union and pay in euro, and then it comes to the shelf and it's priced in Polish zloty. So Polish zloty, I would say, from the moment, okay, I have it, you know, almost 10 years. So the maximum amplitude here is maybe 10%, which is not high. But some currencies, and you know probably from your experience also that they have a much bigger amplitude, you know, much higher differences. So sometimes it becomes really critical. So for example, local currency in Turkey, Turkish lira, depreciated dramatically in the last 5 years, and especially in the last year from 2022 to 2023. So what like local importers should do and what exporters should do if they still want to sell in Turkey? So, Kathryn, good question. So how to mitigate the risk?
I mean, I think that you have to, if you want to keep working together, you have to have the kind of relationship together with your distribution partner that you discuss this together. Because when you have, if you're talking about the amplitude of change in Poland, you can manage this quite easily. You can agree with your importer in Poland that if the zloty moves more than 5% up or 5% down, that the two of you will consider together what that means for both of you. And you can usually manage to discuss together, okay, do we need to change the exchange rate that we're using for our product calculation and therefore change the shelf prices? Or do we, if we are making some money because of the way that the exchange rate has moved, we could invest this extra money into marketing. This is what you can do if it's just the regular kind of currency variations that you're observing on the market. When you start to talk about the sort of extreme situations that you have in Turkey at the moment, the kind of situations that there's been often, you hear often about Argentina is one of those markets which is often has often over the years been affected by this kind of problem, or Lebanon has had a lot of those kind of problems over the years. Then there are things you can do, but what usually happens is that realistically speaking, the shelf price of products to the consumer gets moved a lot, simply because people, the change in currency rate is too extreme to manage that within the price calculation. I mean, of course, there are some currency management tools that you can use to, you can do forward trades and so on to actually guarantee the exchange rate that you're going to get on certain volumes. But this is usually not something that really most companies are looking to do, because it's quite complex to manage, and you need somebody who's a specialist just to take care of these currency factors. So if you are really looking to manage in a situation where you have these very extreme exchange rates, then to be honest, what often happens if you're an importer in a country like Turkey, where the currency has more or less collapsed, you have to try to avoid increasing your prices longer than your competitors do. So if the competitors, for example, increase their prices and you can keep your prices maybe for 2 or 3 weeks longer at a lower rate, you can perhaps gain some benefit from this. But in the end, in this kind of situation, you have to go with the market prices and change, because it's just too extreme to manage. The other thing that can happen in such situations is that at the wholesale level, that companies switch from trading in local currency to trading in whatever is the nearest for them, most closely related hard currency. So that might be US dollars, it might be euros. I've seen that in Lebanon over the years. I've seen it in Kazakhstan over the years, where there's been a currency collapse. And so the wholesalers have all moved to offer more stability. They've all moved to having their price lists in US dollars. And then the onus is on the retailers to kind of manage the prices, end prices to the consumers. So this is the one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. You know, the situation when, for example, local currency is not getting weaker, but the opposite is getting stronger. So it also might happen. And in this case, so it often means that the company, for example, the exporter has to keep in mind some stock compensation for the importer. So, or for example, when the price for some products, this can be such categories like consumer electronics, for example, because, you know, when the new lineup comes to the market, then the old lineup becomes cheaper, dramatically cheaper, very quickly. So if the distributor didn't manage to sell the whole stock, then there should be some stock compensation as well. So because they of course have to give a discount to get rid of the stock, and of course the vendor has to keep in mind of what can be done in this kind of situation and plan it in advance. So, but to answer this kind of question, so we you know, you need to know where do you go. So when you are stepping to a minefield, then first you have to at least clear it a bit. You know that you need some space to step safely and be secured with your next steps. And otherwise, it becomes really dangerous. What I mean is that you need to learn about this market, about the local market rules, etc.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think that people also need to be very aware that the only way you can really the only way that you can really survive in the long term on such a market is to have an ongoing dialogue with your partner, and not just to treat it like a commodity trade where you just sell him product and then you don't care what happens to it after that. So you do have to be aware that if you're talking with your partner, okay, we want to be ideally placed 10% above competitor A and 2% below competitor B on the market, this is always going to be purely a recommendation, because the only things that you can control are the ones which are actually within your own mandate. So in that case, your own margins, and the distributor his own margins. You can't prescribe to the retailer what the shelf price is going to look at, because most jurisdictions don't allow that. So for example, in the EU, if you try to force retail to have a price of €2 for your item, or €10 or 20, the cartel authorities come along and say, that's price fixing. We would like to have 10% of all of your group turnover as a fine, you know. So this is something which is really a huge risk. You have to be very, very careful of this and very aware that it's a very sensitive topic. And I think that up until now, we've been talking about, effectively, we've been talking about individual markets. We've been looking at how to arrive at a shelf price, how to position yourself. We've been talking about how to different ways of dealing with currency, or different ways of finding out about the unknowns. But we haven't actually spoken about the fact that it's really important that you have an international pricing policy, and not just a pricing policy for France and a pricing policy for Algeria and a pricing policy for Poland and one for Turkey, but that you have some kind of unified approach across all of your export markets. Because it doesn't matter whether you're working in consumer electronics, whether you're working in office supplies, food and beverage, whatever, in consumer goods, the world is becoming more and more international, and chances are that in your country there are some kind of retailers who are international retailers. Even if it's only Amazon, there will be some kind of retailer who is an international retailer and who is directly comparable with other markets, where your consumers in Poland can easily look and see what does the product cost in Germany, or what does the product cost in other markets. And if those differences are too big, then you can start to get into problems. So you always, this question of, it's one thing to set the prices, it's another thing to actually have like an actively maintained pricing policy where you're always looking to see at two levels, which are my consumer prices still competitive in all of my markets and positioned where I want them to be, and how do my markets stand in relation to one another. And you have to look at that at both consumer price level, but also at, let's say, net price level, so the price at which the retailer is actually purchasing the product. Because if you talk about a key account who buys in Poland and who buys in France and who buys in Turkey, they're going to look at their prices and say, okay, we have different import taxes maybe, and we have different transport costs, but otherwise the product is more or less the same. So why do I pay 20% more in Turkey than I pay in France? Just as an example. And they will come back to you as a producer at some point and force you to correct that as far as they're concerned. So this is where things start to get much more complicated than maybe in the past, where you could be sure that if you were charging a huge price to the Norwegian distributor, it would never come back to you that you offered the guy in Tunisia a really cheap rate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course. So I fully agree. And, there is also some problem with, for example, gray importation.
Yeah.
So speaking of electronics, for example, even consumers will compare the price, even small wholesalers will compare the price. Okay, maybe it's worth to cross the border and go to China and buy it cheaper, and then it's sell to my market, and then disturb the market, so it actually spoil the local situation for the producer, and it happens all the time. So it depends on the product, but it happens all the time.
With food and beverage, it's often the other way around. It's importers, it's gray importers bringing the product to China who disturb the market in China for all of the European producers, because the prices on food are really high in China. So
I think it's really actual for luxury products, really needed for consumer electronics, this kind of monitoring, so that company really takes care of what kind of price they give to which subsidiary, to whom, to why, and so on. So they have to be really careful, because maybe at the end of the day, the headquarters of the producer will deliver what they expected, but local subsidiaries will have a difficult life,
Yes, it becomes really complex when you start to when you start to do this kind of international key accounting, and you start to really try and follow the how should we say, when you really try to make sure that you have to keep everybody happy, then this is really quite tough. It's not so easy to do.
Yeah, also to whom you give the product. So I had very interesting example in the past with the cosmetics distribution, and when the vendor from Greece actually just before they signed exclusive distribution contract with the local distributor, they also sold some, maybe also it wasn't a container, it was a really small volume to one hairdresser somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And then when the exclusive distributor started to work with this product, you know, this small hairdresser started to spoil this situation on the market, putting this product in the marketplace for a very low price, and distributor doesn't know. So for the vendor, they don't count it. So it's okay, we sold it anyway. So we gave the sex work pricing to this key account and to that key account, but eventually exclusive distributor is one who's paying the price. You know, okay, we can talk about it, I don't know, not 1 hour, but hours and hours, because our experience is really wide with this kind of issues. There are a lot of cases we can mention and discuss, and examples also. The last theoretical thing which I want to share, I really like this model. It's not clear from the first glance, looks like many words in one place, but in fact there's a lot of, you know, a lot of meaning behind it. There is really a sense. So it's called value price thermometer. What is this about? It's about the approach to the end user pricing. So when you calculate your price, so if you get back to this price structure model, then you can see, so the highest price we have this RFP, recommended retail price. So how do we calculate it? So this model explains it fully. I can tell you, even corporations do this. They have the cost of goods. For example, they imported the product from a different headquarter. And they say, okay, so my margin here is 10%. I added on top and I'm done. So don't do this. This is a way of losing a lot of money. So, you know, sometimes even 1% of price increase might change your profit like 10% or 20%. It depends on the product, of course, and the cost of goods. So you have to be really careful with it. Second is that this is not a wise approach, simply because, as I just mentioned, you're leaving money on the table. So what you need to know, what is the perceived value of the product? To know it, it's another story. So you, of course, you should check, you should do some research to understand how much money your consumers are ready to pay for this kind of product. Sometimes companies are doing it in different ways. So they do some price monitoring on the market. So they go do some store check saying that, okay, my direct competitor had the price of, I don't know, $10 or €10 on the market. My brand is still a bit more expensive. So we have some value in our brand. I can add 5% extra on it and I'm done. This is also not a wise approach. So you need to know what is the perceived value for your specific product. And then if you are able, you, in this case, is your marketing department, if you're able to deliver some extra value with your marketing effort, for example, to create a beautiful story behind your brand, or for example, create a specific customer service that no one has, then you can increase price even more and put it at the level of objective value. So that's what I was trying to explain. And I think that this model is very, very important if you understand it. So the main message behind my words is that don't price product simply based on your cost of goods. So you should really, when you create a recommended retail price, the price that your end users will pay for your product, you have to be not just careful, you have to be wise. You have to understand how much value you can deliver for this with this product, so for your consumer, and how can we do this?
Yeah, and I think you have to also understand that this is not just a job that you do when you first start to sell systematically into this market. This is something that you review periodically in order to make sure that you're still not leaving money on the table, or that you're not forcing, on the other hand, that you're not forcing your importer into a situation where he's not earning money anymore, but because maybe he's, first of all, maybe he's too polite to tell you for a while because you have a good relationship, until it gets to the point where the relationship breaks. And then suddenly you realize you could be left with nothing. So I think you have to do this, you have to review this at the very minimum every year, but certainly as soon as any of the parameters in the product calculation change, you have to look at it and see if things are still the same, if things are still valid that you thought were valid. Did with the last round of negotiations, did your distributor have to suddenly increase the margins to retail because retailers have so much higher electricity costs right now, which is what happened to many brands in Europe in the last couple of years, that they had to also somehow compensate for this. You have to remember that however you set the prices and whatever you believe is the marketing that you have to invest into your brand, somewhere along the line, it's the consumer who's going to be paying for all of that. So you have to always be looking how you can get the most value for your brand, even if it doesn't mean that you can increase the shelf price. You might be able to somehow persuade a partner that they are prepared to invest more into the brand because they can see potential or something like this. So this is also money that you shouldn't leave on the table. You also need to negotiate with your partners on these kind of topics as well.
Yeah, I think that we actually shared a lot of insight. So it's probably, there are a lot of things to consider, to think about when you start creating your international pricing policy. And we hope that the next time you find a new partner, you don't just share export price with this partner. You really sit with this partner and decide how much the product should actually cost. If this product goes to the shelf of the retail chain or even traditional trade or to some marketplaces. Okay, we have some questions at this moment, and we have also, like, we can do some 10 extra minutes for this.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, we have one very active participant.
Lots of questions from Palma. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, eczema industry. Okay. I mean, I think that you need to, of course, you need to take care of internal factors. You need to take care of legal factors, and you also need to take care, when you're doing your pricing strategy, you need to look around, and so you need to take care of the factors that impact every stakeholder in the value chain, but also you need to look at your colleagues. So, for example, there's no point if you're selling within Europe and you're selling into the Baltic markets, you can't, but you're not responsible for Poland or for Germany. You can't ignore what's happening in Poland or Germany with your type of products, simply because both of those large markets have a strong influence on the retail sector in the Baltic countries. Or if you're working, for example, in the Netherlands, you have to also keep a close eye on what's happening in Belgium and maybe what's happening in France and probably also what's happening in Germany. So that phrase that no man is an island really is true when it comes to your pricing policy. You always have to be looking, you always have to be doing these, let's say, little loops of going back and checking, is what I decided 1 quarter ago, is it still valid, or do I need to reassess? I think that that is really important.
Yeah. Okay, what other questions we have?
Strategic part about strategies for market entry and expansion for strategic pricing in emerging economies. Do you mean that you're selling to emerging economies or that you're selling from emerging economies? Because I think that that's maybe a little bit, it's maybe a little bit different approach depending on whether you're selling from, for example, India into Europe.
Yeah, I mean that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think if you're selling from India into Europe, there's going to be two questions that you're faced with. On the one hand, there's a kind of expectation that the products are going to be cheaper than a local product or a local brand. And on the other hand, you have to convince of the quality of your product. So you have basically two options. You either invest into marketing and show that you are effectively a brand, or you go with the very kind of commodity type approach and you look to sell as cheap as possible, depending on what kind of product it is that you have. But you still need to look and to see what possibilities that you have, because you obviously don't want to be selling just as cheaply as possible and then to realize later, as Nadya mentioned earlier, you don't want to realize later you could have sold at a 5% or even just a 3% higher price, and it might have almost doubled your profitability. So you have to really do this full calculation and see and really know what your costs are, so that you can really be sure in the end of the day, what options do you have for changing the strategy, and which sections of the strategy can you influence yourself?
Okay. Okay, so so I think that we will, of course, keep this webinar. We will put it in our YouTube channel. So what I have to do still is to say thank you so much, Kathryn. So your experience is tremendous. So really, thanks a lot. We will continue our webinars. We are doing it simply like once a month. Maybe we'll do it more often soon, because we want, our simple target here is to educate the audience, to just explain maybe our learnings, our insights, so that companies make less mistakes, and become like more educated maybe. So we're happy to share what we know, and we're always open also to discuss it if you need.
Yeah, and I'm just going to drop my LinkedIn link in the chat. So if anybody would like to connect, then I'm very open to connect. And if anybody has something specific that they think of, you know, that they wake up at 4 in the morning and think I should have asked this question, then you can drop me a DM tomorrow and ask me something.
Yeah, so I mean, I have experience working with Eastern Europe. Kathryn has experience working with the whole world, or at least half of the world, I would say. So to gain something like that, you need years and years. So it's many years, actually. Okay. Thank you so much again. So please follow our page in LinkedIn.